For 8 seasons, from 1987 to 1995, Dave Coulier made America laugh every single Friday night. He was Joey Gladstone, the comedian in the attic, the man who could do 40 voices before breakfast and reduce an entire studio audience to tears of laughter with 3 words alone: cut it out. He built one of the most beloved sitcom characters in the history of American television and earned a place in the living rooms and the hearts of an entire generation. But behind that legacy of laughter lies a story not glamorous, but devastating in a way that almost nobody saw coming. In the span of 15 months, between November of 2024 and February of 2026, Dave Coulier fought not one, but 2 completely separate, completely unrelated cancers. Stage 3 lymphoma. And then, days after celebrating that, the first cancer was gone. A second diagnosis, a different cancer entirely, a different fight entirely. While he was still smiling from the first victory, the doctors called him back. He had to begin again. Here is the paradox that defines Dave Coulier at 66. The man who made the world laugh spent over a year quietly fighting for his life in hospital corridors, and then walked out the other side. Both cancers gone. Yesterday, he danced backstage at a nostalgia convention with John Stamos and Jodie Sweetin. That is not a metaphor. That is what actually happened. If Dave Coulier, a man who fought cancer twice and came back dancing, has ever made you laugh, ever made you feel the warmth of a family that wasn't yours but felt like it was, hit like right now as a tribute to one of the most quietly resilient men in the history of American television. And it is remarkable, it is almost beyond comprehension, that the story of this resilience begins not with the disease that tried to stop him, but with a childhood in Michigan that had already taught him everything he would need to survive it. Yesterday, Dave Coulier walked onto a convention stage in Orlando, Florida, and the crowd rose to meet him. Not out of obligation, not out of nostalgia alone, out of something closer to relief. The particular relief that comes when someone you were afraid of losing is suddenly standing right in front of you, whole and present and real. He was there with John Stamos, with Jodie Sweetin, with Lori Loughlin and Andrea Barber, the most complete gathering of the original Full House cast since the world lost Bob Saget in January of 2022. And Dave Coulier, the man who had spent 15 months moving between chemotherapy chairs and radiation tables and hospital waiting rooms, was at the center of it. Laughing, dancing, delivering the message he had crossed the country to deliver. The event was Nostalgia Con. The date was August 8th, 2026. And for anyone who had followed the quiet, grueling story of what Dave Coulier had endured in the 14 months prior, the image of him on that stage was not merely heartwarming, it was staggering. Because the stage in Orlando was a stage he had no guarantee of ever reaching. John Stamos posted the video to TikTok. Coulier and Sweetin and Stamos moving together backstage, laughing, fully present, and within hours it had moved across every platform with the specific velocity that only genuine emotion can generate. Not celebrity spectacle, something quieter and more difficult to name. The recognition, perhaps, that what you were watching was a man who had been given back something that had been genuinely at risk of being taken. From that stage, Coulier told the audience what the doctors had told him. He told them he felt great. He told them the scans were clean. And then, because this is who Dave Coulier is at 66, shaped by everything the last 15 months had cost him, he told them the only thing he really came to Orlando to say: early detection is everything. Talk to your doctors. Get checked. Get every exam you can get. That was the message. That was the mission. That is the man. But to understand what it means that Dave Coulier is standing on that stage delivering that message, to understand the full weight of yesterday, you have to go back. Not to the diagnosis, not to the first chemotherapy session. You have to go back much further than that. You have to go back to a boy in Michigan who learned very early that the world did not hand you anything, and that the only way through was straight ahead. David Allen Coulier was born on September 21, 1959, in St. Clair Shores, Michigan, a working-class suburb on the eastern edge of Detroit, pressed up against Lake St. Clair, the kind of place where people built things with their hands and measured their neighbors by how hard they worked and how little they complained. It was not a place of inherited advantage. It was a place of earned character, and it shaped Dave Coulier in ways that would not become fully visible until decades later, when he was sitting in an oncologist's office being told, for the second time in 12 months, that his body was fighting something it had never asked to fight. His father, Dave Coulier Sr., worked as a Ford Motor Company executive. His mother, Carolyn, raised the family with the steady, grounding presence that working-class Michigan households often demanded of mothers. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were the kind of American family that believed in showing up, to work, to obligation, to each other. And that belief was transmitted to their son, not through instruction, but through example, day after day, in a house where effort was the baseline and quitting was simply not a vocabulary that existed. What Dave Coulier had, from almost the beginning, was the gift of making people laugh. Not the polished, workshop-refined comedy of someone who studied the craft academically. Something rawer and more instinctive than that. He was the kid in the room who could read the atmosphere in seconds and find the one angle, the one voice, the one perfectly timed physical gesture that would collapse everyone around him into laughter. He had, even as a child, an almost physical relationship with humor, as though the comedy wasn't something he performed, but something he metabolized, something his nervous system processed the world through. He attended John Paul II High School in St. Clair Shores, where the comedic instinct became something more deliberate. He began performing stand-up comedy as a teenager, an almost audacious thing to do, to stand in front of adults and demand their laughter before you are old enough to have earned their respect through any conventional measure. But Coulier understood something that most teenagers do not, that laughter is a form of trust, and that if you can make someone laugh genuinely, you have reached them in a place that almost nothing else can access. He was reaching people from the very beginning. What made him unusual, what separated him from the dozens of other young comedians working the clubs in and around Michigan in the late 1970s, was the voices. Dave Coulier could do impressions with an accuracy and a range that bordered on the unsettling. Cartoon characters, politicians, fellow comedians. He could shift from one register to another mid-sentence and land each one with the confidence of someone who had lived inside that voice for years. It was not a party trick. It was a craft, and it was the craft that would eventually carry him out of Michigan and into a television studio in Los Angeles where everything would change. He moved to Los Angeles in pursuit of something that had no guaranteed outcome and no safety net beneath it. Stand-up work, television auditions, the grinding, humbling, occasionally exhilarating process of trying to make a career out of the one thing you were born knowing how to do. He worked. He performed. He built a reputation in the comedy clubs that was quiet but real. The reputation of someone who delivered every single time, who never mailed it in, who treated a half-empty Tuesday night club with the same seriousness he would later bring to a Friday night network audience of 20 million. And then Full House found him. Or rather, he found Full House in the specific way that a decade of relentless, unglamorous preparation tends to eventually find its moment. The audition was not a miracle. It was the inevitable collision of a role that needed exactly what Dave Coulier had been building since he was a teenager in St. Clair Shores, the warmth, the voices, the physical comedy, the instinctive ability to connect with both children and adults simultaneously. And a man who had been building those exact tools for the better part of a decade without knowing precisely what they were being built for. Joey Gladstone. The comedian who moved into the Tanner house to help raise 3 girls after tragedy struck the family. The man who was never the coolest person in the room, but was always the kindest. Who could do 40 impressions but wore his heart entirely on the outside of his chest. Who made the children laugh when they needed to laugh and sat with them in the dark when laughter was not what was needed. It was, in retrospect, not a role that Dave Coulier played. It was a role that Dave Coulier inhabited, because the qualities that made Joey Gladstone beloved to an entire generation were not performed qualities. They were the qualities that St. Clair Shores and a life of earning everything the hard way had already built into the man before the cameras ever rolled. What does it mean that the boy who learned to make people laugh in Michigan, the boy who moved to Los Angeles with nothing but talent and discipline and an almost stubborn refusal to stop, would one day stand on a stage in Orlando and use that same voice, the one he had been sharpening since adolescence, to tell 20 million people to go see their doctors? Everything. It means everything. But the answer to that question begins in 1987, when Full House premiered, and America met Joey Gladstone for the very first time, and Dave Coulier's life changed in a way that no one, least of all him, could fully have anticipated. There are moments in a life that divide everything cleanly into before and after. Not gradually, not with warning, with the particular surgical precision of a single sentence spoken in a clinical room by someone in a white coat. And then the silence that follows it, which is unlike any other silence a human being will ever experience. For Dave Coulier, that sentence arrived in November of 2024. He was 65 years old. He had just celebrated the 30th anniversary of Full House's final season. He had a wife, Melissa, whom he had married in 2014 after a decade of friendship that had quietly deepened into something neither of them had entirely planned. He had a son, Luke. He had a life that was full in the specific way that lives become full when the noise of ambition has quieted, and what remains is real. Relationships, mornings, the ordinary texture of days that you stop taking for granted because you are old enough to know how quickly they can change. The diagnosis was non-Hodgkin lymphoma, stage 3. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma is a cancer of the lymphatic system, the network of vessels and nodes that runs through the human body, carrying white blood cells and serving as one of the primary mechanisms of immune defense. Stage 3 means the cancer has spread to lymph nodes on both sides of the diaphragm, or has extended into an organ or tissue beyond the lymph nodes. It is not the earliest stage. It is not the latest. It is the stage at which the disease has established itself with enough confidence to demand a serious, aggressive, sustained response. The doctor told him it was very treatable. Coulier would later recall those words with the particular mixture of gratitude and terror that only a cancer patient can fully understand. The relief of hearing that the fight is winnable, balanced against the full comprehension of what winning it is going to cost. The treatment protocol was R-CHOP chemotherapy. 6 cycles. R-CHOP is the standard of care for aggressive non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a combination of 5 agents working in concert to attack the cancer cells from multiple angles simultaneously. Rituximab, which targets a specific protein on the surface of lymphoma cells. Cyclophosphamide. doxorubicin, vincristine, prednisone. Each cycle delivered intravenously over the course of hours. Each cycle followed by days of recovery that test the body's reserves in ways that are difficult to describe and impossible to fully prepare for. 6 cycles, spread across months. A sustained assault on the disease that is also, inevitably, a sustained assault on the body fighting it. The side effects of RCHOP are not subtle. Fatigue so complete that it rewrites a person's relationship to rest. Not the tiredness of a long day, but a heaviness that settles into the bones and does not lift. Nausea, hair loss. The vulnerability of a compromised immune system that turns ordinary environments into calculations of risk. Dave Coulier went through all of it, quietly, for the most part, with the same disposition that St. Clair Shores had built into him. Head down, keep moving, do not perform the suffering for an audience that did not ask to witness it. And then John Stamos shaved his head. It was not a publicity gesture. It was not a carefully managed social media moment designed to generate engagement. It was a friend, a man who had stood beside Dave Coulier for nearly 4 decades, since the days when they were both young men navigating the specific pressures of sudden television fame, deciding that if his friend was going to lose his hair to chemotherapy, he was going to lose his too. John Stamos, with his famously full hair, the hair that had been part of his public identity for as long as most of his fans could remember, shaved it to the scalp, in solidarity, without announcement, because that is what you do for someone who is fighting for his life and needs to know he is not fighting alone. The image circulated immediately. Fans of Full House who had grown up watching Joey Gladstone and Uncle Jesse navigate the beautiful, chaotic warmth of the Tanner household, who were now in their 40s and 50s, with children of their own, with their own accumulation of loss and survival, responded to that image with an emotion that was difficult to categorize. It was not simply touching, it was the recognition of something real in a media landscape that often struggles to produce it. 2 men, genuinely bound to each other by decades of shared history, one of them sick, and the other refusing to let him be sick alone. Melissa Coulier was present through all of it. She had married Dave in 2014 in a ceremony that friends described as intimate and genuinely joyful. The wedding of 2 people who had not rushed toward each other, but had arrived at each other with full knowledge of who they were. She was beside him through the diagnosis, through the 6 cycles, through the days when the treatment was winning and the days when it felt like everything was simply wait. The particular courage of the person who stands next to the patient and does not flinch, who wakes up every morning inside the same fear and chooses every single morning to be present anyway, is a courage that rarely gets named. Melissa Coulier carried it without complaint and without performance, which is the only way it can be genuinely carried. By April of 2025, Dave Coulier received the news he had been fighting toward for 5 months. The scans were clean. The lymphoma was gone. He was cancer-free. He told the people closest to him first. Then he told the public, with the particular gratitude of someone who understands, in a visceral and non-abstract way, that the outcome could have been different. He celebrated. Of course he celebrated. 5 months of chemotherapy, 6 cycles of RCHOP. The fatigue and the fear, and the months of not knowing with certainty what the next scan would show. He had earned the celebration completely. But the celebration lasted only days. Because, while Dave Coulier was still smiling, while the relief was still fresh, and the gratitude was still new, and the future had just reopened in front of him like a door he had been afraid was closing, the doctors found something else. Something the follow-up scans had caught that no one had been looking for. something completely unrelated to the lymphoma, something that had its own name, its own biology, its own treatment protocol, and its own particular demand on a man who had just spent 5 months giving everything he had to a fight he had already won. The question is not whether Dave Coulier had anything left. The question is what a man made of the specific material that St. Clair Shores produces does, when the answer to that question is tested a second time, without pause, without mercy, without the grace of even a full season of recovery between battles. There is a particular cruelty to the timing that no clinical language can adequately contain. Dave Coulier had done everything right. He had submitted to 6 cycles of one of the most demanding chemotherapy protocols in modern oncology. He had shown up for every session, endured every side effect, trusted the doctors and the medicine and the process, even on the days when trust was the hardest thing to maintain. He had watched his friend John Stamos shave his head in solidarity and drawn from that gesture the specific sustenance that only genuine human connection can provide in the darkest corridors of a serious illness. He had held on to Melissa. He had held on to Luke. He had kept moving forward with the particular stubbornness of a man raised in a Michigan household where forward was the only direction that existed. And it had worked. April of 2025. Clean scans. No evidence of lymphoma. Cancer-free. The relief that follows a cancer all clear is not a simple emotion. It is layered and complicated and shot through with a gratitude so intense it is almost indistinguishable from grief. The grief of having understood, fully and without abstraction, how close the other outcome had been. Dave Coulier had lived inside that understanding for 5 months. He had felt the weight of it every morning when he woke up and every evening when he went to sleep. And now, suddenly, the weight was gone. The future was open. The scans were clean. He was 65 years old and cancer-free, and the world was asking nothing of him except to enjoy it. He celebrated. Quietly, in the way of a man who has never been drawn to public performance of private emotion. With his wife, with his son, with the small circle of people who had been present through the months when public performance was the last thing on his mind. It was not a grand gesture. It was something more valuable than that. It was simply the ordinary texture of a life resuming. Meals, mornings, the uncomplicated pleasure of a day that does not begin with a treatment appointment or a blood draw or a conversation about what the latest numbers mean. Days later, the phone rang. The follow-up scans, the routine monitoring that oncology protocols require even after an all-clear, the careful surveillance that good medicine maintains precisely because the body does not always announce its complications in advance, had found something. Not lymphoma, not a recurrence of what had already been treated and defeated. Something different. Something that existed in an entirely separate biological category from the cancer he had just beaten. Something that the lymphoma had nothing to do with and had not caused and had not predicted. The diagnosis, when it came, was P16 squamous cell carcinoma, specifically oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma, cancer of the base of the tongue, a disease frequently associated with the human papillomavirus, with a biology and a progression entirely distinct from non-Hodgkin lymphoma, arriving not as a complication of the first fight, but as a completely independent second front in a war Dave Coulier had not declared and had not chosen and had not finished recovering from. He would later describe the moment of the second diagnosis with a directness that carried more weight than any dramatization could have managed. He told the doctors, did this happen because of the lymphoma? He needed to understand the connection. He needed there to be a logic, a causal thread between the first cancer and the second that would make the sequence comprehensible, that would give the cruelty of the timing some kind of coherent shape. The doctors told him, totally unrelated. 2 words. The full weight of them is difficult to overstate. Not a recurrence. Not a metastasis. Not a complication of the chemotherapy or a consequence of the immune suppression that aggressive cancer treatment inevitably produces. A second, independent, biologically unrelated cancer, arriving in the narrow window between the end of one fight and the beginning of whatever was supposed to come next. The statistical improbability of it is almost beside the point. The lived reality of it, the experience of a man who had just clawed his way back to health and been told, in the same breath as his celebration, that the clawing was not finished, is what matters. Dave Coulier did not collapse. He did not perform despair for an audience. He did not retreat into bitterness about the injustice of a timeline that had taken from him even the basic courtesy of a full recovery before demanding another fight. He did what the boy from Saint-Ouen, Claire's Shores, had always done when the thing in front of him was difficult. He assessed it. He asked the right questions. He listened to the doctors. And then he began again. The treatment for P16 oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma. When caught at the stage at which Coulier's was caught, which is precisely the argument he would later carry to every stage and every camera and every convention panel he could find, carries a cure rate of 90% or higher. The disease is responsive to radiation when targeted precisely and delivered consistently. It is not a guaranteed outcome. Medicine does not deal in guarantees, but it is, by the standards of oncology, a genuinely favorable prognosis for a patient whose cancer has been identified before it has had the opportunity to advance beyond the reach of treatment. 35 sessions of targeted radiation therapy, beginning in the months following the second diagnosis, delivered with the focused precision that modern radiation oncology makes possible. Directed at the specific site of the disease with an accuracy designed to maximize the impact on the cancer and minimize the collateral cost to the surrounding tissue. 35 sessions, each one its own small act of discipline, each one another morning of showing up for the fight, even when showing up was the hardest thing available. The radiation ended on December 31st, 2025, New Year's Eve, the last day of the year in which Dave Coulier had fought 2 completely separate cancers, endured 6 cycles of chemotherapy and 35 sessions of radiation, watched his closest friends shave their heads in solidarity, leaned on his wife and his son, and the accumulated strength of a life built on the conviction that forward is the only direction that exists, and had not stopped, had not quit, had not given the disease the satisfaction of a man diminished. He walked out of the radiation facility on the last day of 2025 and into the first hours of 2026, and the question that had been hanging over 15 months of fighting finally had an answer within reach. The scans would tell the story. The doctors would read the results, and Dave Coulier, 66 years old, twice diagnosed, twice treated, and still standing, would wait in the particular silence that follows the end of a fight before the verdict has been declared, to find out what the next chapter of his life was going to look like. The 4th of February, 2026 began like any other morning for the people who had been quietly following Dave Coulier's story through the long months of treatment. A morning like the ones that had preceded it, carrying the specific, low-grade tension of waiting that becomes so familiar over the course of a serious illness that it almost stops registering as tension and begins to feel simply like the weather, the background condition of a life suspended between what has happened and what is about to be confirmed. And then the confirmation came. The follow-up scans, the comprehensive imaging that oncology requires after the completion of a full treatment course, the final accounting of what the medicine has done, and what the disease has left behind, returned clean. Both cancers, gone. Non-Hodgkin lymphoma, stage 3, treated with 6 cycles of R-CHOP chemotherapy. In remission. P16, oropharyngeal squamous cell carcinoma, treated with 35 sessions of targeted radiation. In remission. 2 independent diagnoses, 2 independent treatment protocols, 2 independent victories. One man, 66 years old, who had walked into the worst 15 months of his life and walked out the other side with clean scans and a mission that had not existed before the illness gave it to him. The official announcement came on May 9, 2026, when Dave Coulier appeared on Good Morning America, the program that has served as the public square of American morning life for decades, the place where the country processes its shared news together over coffee and the particular vulnerability of early morning attention. He sat in that studio and he delivered the words that everyone who had been following his journey had been waiting to hear. I am in remission with both cancers. And what a journey this has been. The simplicity of the phrasing is what gives it its full weight. Not a carefully constructed statement shaped by a publicist. Not a performance of relief calibrated for maximum emotional impact. Simply the words of a man who had been asked a question and was answering it with the same directness and lack of ornamentation that had characterized everything about the way he had moved through the preceding 15 months. He was in remission, both cancers, and it had been a journey. He described it as a roller coaster ride, a phrase so familiar that it risks sliding past attention without registering. And yet, in the mouth of a man who has actually lived the specific sequence that Dave Coulier lived, the phrase recovers its full meaning. The diagnosis of the lymphoma, the 6 cycles of chemotherapy, the all clear in April, the days of celebration, the second diagnosis, unrelated, unexpected, arriving in the narrow space between one victory and whatever was supposed to come next, the 35 sessions of radiation, the last day of treatment on New Year's Eve, and then the waiting, the quiet, unglamorous, deeply human experience of waiting for confirmation that the fight was actually finished. A roller coaster. Yes, exactly that. The specific vocabulary of a man who is not reaching for poetry, but simply describing as accurately as he can what the experience felt like from the inside. But what Dave Coulier did on Good Morning America that morning was not simply announce his own recovery. He used the platform, the millions of people watching over breakfast, the reach of a morning program that touches households across every demographic and every geography of American life, to say something that had become, in the preceding 15 months, the most important thing he knew. He had never wanted, he admitted, to be the poster boy for cancer. The phrase landed with a particular honesty because it is a sentiment that most people in his position would privately feel and few would publicly articulate. There is a specific kind of pressure that comes with a public illness, the expectation that the diagnosed person will assume the role of ambassador, will transform their suffering into advocacy, will find the meaning in the experience and deliver it to an audience that needs the meaning more than it needs the complexity. Dave Coulier understood that pressure and named it directly. He had not asked for this role. And then he accepted it anyway. Because the alternative, having access to a platform that could reach people who had not yet spoken to their doctors, who had not yet scheduled the prostate exam or the mammogram or the routine screening that might catch something early enough to matter, and choosing not to use that platform was not something he was willing to do. Get those prostate exams. Get those mammograms. Talk to your doctors. Get ahead of this. The words are not complicated. They do not require medical expertise to understand or clinical language to deliver. They are the words of a man who has been on the other side of early detection, whose P16 squamous cell carcinoma was caught at a stage where the cure rate exceeds 90%, precisely because the monitoring was thorough, and the follow-up was consistent, and the medicine had the opportunity to do what medicine does when it is given the chance to work before the disease has established itself beyond its reach. Dave Coulier is not speaking as a celebrity endorsing a cause that has been handed to him by a publicist. He is speaking as a patient who understands, from the inside, what the difference between early detection and late detection means in the lived experience of a human body and a human life. That is a different kind of authority. It is the authority of someone who has earned the right to say what he is saying through 15 months of chemotherapy chairs and radiation tables and clean scans and the particular, indescribable relief of hearing those words, in remission, applied to not one, but two separate fights that he had no guarantee of winning. And then there is the shadow that sits at the edge of every Full House story told in the years since January of 2022. Bob Saget, Danny Tanner, the man who was not merely Dave Coulier's co-star for 8 seasons, but his closest friend in the specific, irreplaceable way that shared formative experience creates closeness that cannot be manufactured or replicated. Bob Saget died on January 23, 2022, at 65 years old, in his hotel room in Orlando, the same city where, yesterday, the cast gathered to celebrate Coulier's survival. He was found the morning after a performance. He was 65. Dave Coulier, standing in Orlando on August 8, 2026, was 66. 1 year older than his best friend ever got to be. The loss of Bob Saget did something to the Full House family that time has not fully resolved and probably cannot fully resolve. Because some losses do not resolve, they simply become part of the permanent architecture of the people who carry them. Dave Coulier carries it. John Stamos carries it. Jodie Sweetin carries it. The grief is present in every reunion, every panel, every gathering of people who built something together and then lost one of the builders before the building was finished. It was present in Orlando. It will always be present. But Dave Coulier is present too. That is the fact that the 8th of August, 2026 insists upon. He is present. He is 66 years old and in remission from 2 cancers and standing on a stage in Orlando with the people he loves, delivering the message that the disease gave him. He is here. And the question of what that presence means, what it costs, what it represents, what it asks of every person watching, is the question that the final chapter of this story is built to answer. Yesterday morning, before the panel, before the audience, before the moment when Dave Coulier would stand at a microphone in Orlando and deliver the words he had crossed the country to say, John Stamos posted a video to TikTok. It was not a produced piece of content. It was not a carefully lit promotional clip assembled by a team of people whose job is to make celebrities look spontaneous. It was backstage footage, Coulier and Stamos and Jodie Sweetin, moving together in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have known each other for 4 decades and have long since stopped performing for each other. Dancing, laughing, fully present in a moment that nobody had scripted and nobody needed to. The video moved across every platform within hours, not because it was spectacular, but because it was real. Because what it showed was not celebrity. What it showed was survival. What it showed was a man who had spent 15 months in the machinery of serious illness and had come out the other side still capable of dancing backstage with his friends before walking out to face an audience. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, the entire thing. The Nostalgia Con panel brought together the most complete gathering of the original Full House cast since the world lost Bob Saget in January of 2022. Dave Coulier, John Stamos, Jodie Sweetin, Lori Loughlin, Andrea Barber. 5 of the people who had built one of the most beloved ensemble casts in the history of American network television, sitting together on a stage in Orlando, approaching the 40th anniversary of a show that first aired in 1987 and has not stopped mattering to the people who grew up inside it. The room held the specific energy that only genuine shared history can produce. Not the performed warmth of a promotional appearance, but the real warmth of people who have been through things together and know it and feel it in each other's presence. Dave Coulier told the audience he felt great. He told them the doctors had cleared him. He told them the scans showed nothing, which is, in the language of oncology, the most beautiful sentence available. The sentence that means the medicine worked and the body held and the fight is finished. Nothing. The doctors do not see anything, which is fantastic. And then he said the thing he came to Orlando to say. He told the audience, the room full of people who had grown up watching Full House on Friday nights, who were now in their 40s and 50s and 60s, who had their own doctors they had been meaning to call, and their own screenings they had been meaning to schedule, and their own quiet, private negotiations with the vulnerability of a body that is aging and cannot be taken for granted. He told them that after going through this, after living inside the specific experience of 2 independent cancer diagnoses in 15 months, the thing he understood with a clarity that no amount of reading or secondhand knowledge could have given him was this: early detection is everything. The words are simple. The authority behind them is not. Dave Coulier is not delivering a public health message that someone handed him on a card. He is delivering the distilled conclusion of 15 months of chemotherapy and radiation and waiting rooms and clean scans and the particular cellular understanding of what it means to have a disease caught early enough for medicine to do its work. P16 squamous cell carcinoma, caught at the stage at which his was caught, carries a cure rate of 90% or higher. That number is not abstract. It is the number that explains why Dave Coulier is standing on a stage in Orlando, instead of not standing anywhere at all. It is the number that early detection produces, the number that does not exist when the disease is given the time and the space to advance beyond the reach of treatment. Talk to your doctors. Get checked. Get all those exams you can get. There will be people in the audience at NostalgiaCon who make a phone call this week that they would not have made otherwise. There will be people watching the TikTok video, watching the panel footage, reading the coverage of yesterday's reunion, who schedule an appointment they have been postponing for months or years. Dave Coulier knows this. He has always known it, from the moment on Good Morning America in May, when he stood in front of a national audience and accepted the role he had never wanted, and could not, in good conscience, refuse. The poster boy for cancer. The man who did not ask for the platform, but used it because not using it would have been a different kind of loss entirely. Full House turns 40 next year. The show that Dave Coulier spent 8 seasons building, that he built alongside Bob Saget and John Stamos, and a cast of people who became, in the specific way that shared formative experience creates family, genuinely his family, turns 40 in 2087. 4 decades since Joey Gladstone first walked into the Tanner house and said, "Cut it out," and made an entire generation laugh. 4 decades of syndication and streaming and children who grew up watching reruns, and adults who still carry the warmth of it in the specific, private way that the best television embeds itself in a life. The show is 40 years old, and it is still, somehow, present. still mattering, still producing reunions that fill convention halls in Orlando, and TikTok videos that move across platforms in hours. And Dave Coulier is still here to see it. That is the fact that the 8th of August, 2026 insists upon, quietly and without drama. He is 66 years old. He is 1 year older than Bob Saget ever got to be. He has fought 2 cancers and beaten both of them. He danced backstage yesterday with the people he loves before walking out to tell a room full of strangers that early detection saved his life and could save theirs. He delivered the message with the same warmth and the same directness and the same complete absence of self-pity that the boy from St. Clair Shores has always brought to everything. To the stand-up clubs, to the Full House set, to the chemotherapy chair, to the radiation table, to the Good Morning America studio, to the Nostalgia Con stage. That is Dave Coulier at 66. Not the tragedy of the illness, not the miracle of the survival. The simple, human, genuinely moving fact of a man who went through something enormous and came out the other side still entirely himself, still warm, still funny, still reaching for the one thing he has always known how to do, which is to connect with people in the place where connection actually matters. If this story has moved you, if the image of Dave Coulier dancing backstage in Orlando, 15 months after his first cancer diagnosis, has reached you in the place where real things reach you, leave a tribute in the comments for a man who gave this generation laughter for 8 seasons and is now asking for something simple in return. Go see your doctor. Schedule the exam you have been postponing. Make the call. Have you or someone you love been touched by a cancer diagnosis that early detection changed? Share your story in the comments below. Because Dave Coulier came to Orlando yesterday, not to be celebrated, but to start a conversation. And that conversation deserves to continue long after the convention lights go down. And if you are not yet subscribed to Golden Fame News, if this is the first story of ours that has found you, subscribe now. Because this is what we do here. We tell the stories of the people who shaped the culture that shaped you, with the full weight and the full honesty that those stories deserve. Dave Coulier deserves that, and so do you.